Brad Feld is back on the show. He joins us today from Aspen. He's a founding partner at Foundry and a co-founder of Techstars. Brad has invested in companies including Zynga, Fitbit, Harmonix, Havenly, Mapbox, and Formlabs, amongst many others. He's a prolific writer and recently released his new book, Give First, which explores how a philosophy of mentorship and generosity can fuel entrepreneurial ecosystems. Brad, welcome back.
Thanks. Delighted to be here.
It's been too long. For long-term listeners, Brad was the 10th guest we ever had on the show back in 2014. And I got to tell you, Brad, I think we went from maybe 600 total listeners, to 6,000 after your appearance. So I owe you a lot for helping us kickstart this whole thing from back in the
Hello,
day.
my new 5,400 friends.
There we go. So Brad's back. Brad, I would love to start out just with a recap on Foundry before we jump into the book. So Foundry has decided not to raise a new fund. Can you talk a bit about that decision and why, you're going to deploy the rest of the current fund and not do another?
Sure. When we started Foundry in 2007, one of our sort of viewpoints and perspectives of what we're trying to do was not create a multi-generational firm. So Seth, Ryan, Jason, and I sat down and said, you know what, we're going to raise a number of funds. We don't know how many. We're never going to increase the size of the fund. It's going to just be a small firm and just us. And one day we'll decide that we raised our last fund. And that was part of what we told all of our LPs. That was part of our fundraising pitch. That was part of what we talked about. And of course, 2007, we were just getting started with Foundry after having, all spent time and worked together. Mobius, which had been a spin-out from SoftBank and affiliated with SoftBank going back to when I started, co-founded that fund in the mid-90s or 1996. So we had this starting point. Now, we raised the fund. We raised the fund in 2010. We raised the fund in 2013. And then in 2016, we did something different. We didn't follow that starting point of we're never going to add anybody and we're never going to raise a bigger fund. So we ended up adding Lyndall Ekman to our team. Lyndall was our largest LP from Utimco, and we ended up raising bigger funds. That was really a culmination of two things. One was, personally, I've been investing in venture funds going back to 1997. My very first venture fund investment was in Highland Capital 3, a long, long time ago. And my personal investments in venture funds started off as an, entrepreneur investing in side funds, but then continued. And so I did that a lot, especially as early and seed stage venture started coming back in, 2004. I invested in the first USB fund, that Fred and Brad did. 2006, 2007, invested in, Josh Koppelman's first fund, invested in Mano Kumar's first fund. So I was doing a bunch of that stuff. And then my partners and I started investing together in funds with our own money. We created an entity that we pulled our capital, and I think by 2015, we'd probably made 200 venture fund investments. And of course, at this point, early stage venture funds are appearing all over the place. Every day we're getting inbound email. And it really turned from a hobby that was quite a good financial hobby and was a lot of fun and was powerful support of other early stage funds, especially ones that were getting created, to something that was, it's very hard when you're getting, a half a dozen things a week to be discerning about what you're going to invest in, especially when, 80% of it is people you don't know. It might be really interesting, but you have no idea. So we ended up coming up with a strategy that we called Foundry Group Next. And in hindsight, we really created a new fund, a new firm. It had some different dynamics around it. We still had, at that point, an early stage fund. So we raised the same 2016 fund, but then we raised this $500 million fund that was investing in venture funds, about 30% of the capital. And then late stage, or not late stage, but Series B, Series C type later stage, select style deals is what we referred to it as. Companies that were now escape velocity and working, but still weren't super expensive. We then sort of built off that for a couple of years. In 2018, we raised a combined fund that combined those two funds. And I think this was a moment in time where we started trying to think about what we were doing long term. And I was getting to the place where if we hadn't done that, in other words, if we had raised only a 2016 fund, I was getting personally to the place where I was ready to say this is my last fund. A lot of things happened between 2018 and when we raised a fund that is our 2022 fund. One of the things was we committed to commit that fund over 4 years. So our LPs, unlike a lot of other funds in the 19 and 20 timeframe that got committed in one year, like the speed just really sped up. Our LPs are like, hey, you guys are raising a bigger fund. It's a small team. Want to make sure you don't deploy it too fast. And, we're big believers in time diversity. And so we said, yep, no problem. Like, here's the pacing for this size fund for us. And then we held to it. And interestingly, by 2020 and even in 2021, we had a lot of LPs that said, why are you going so slow? So it's very confusing. Like, there's a dissonance there. And, it's also hard when everybody's like, well, yeah, your funds are, gosh, you look at where your funds are at. Like, well, we're still putting brand new money in the ground. Like, we're still putting money into companies. Like, this is the start of the investment. There's no markups when you put it into the ground in 2021 or even 2022. That's new capital that's starting the clock.
It wasn't popular to be slow at the time.
No. And so that was kind of interesting, but kind of in this period of time, we spent a lot of time talking about like, what are we going to, what's the trajectory? And we decided to raise another 22 fund in 2022. I was all in on that. Seth and Ryan, who were the other two founding partners, were all in on it. Jason had at this point retired. We'd added a few more partners, Lyndall, Jacqueline, and Moody. And so I think we were all pretty aligned on, let's do a fund together. That's a 2022 fund. We call it 22 fund. It first close was in 2022. Second fund was spring of 23. And we started deploying it late 22. And at that moment, like, we had a decision to make. And we didn't make the decision the day after we closed the fund. But the decision to make was, are we going to do another fund as a team? And at that moment in time, we let ourselves sit with it for the better part of 2023, knowing full well a couple of things. I knew that I wasn't going to sign up for another fund. Would I, be comfortable with Foundry continuing forward? Of course, if that was the right answer. But I'm about to turn 60 now. The last Mobius fund that I was responsible for took 22 years to close down. So, this illusion that venture funds last 10 years is nonsense. And even, 12 years, nonsense. I'm still involved as an LP in funds that go back prior to 2007. Whew. And yes, there's a lot of mechanisms that people have that, you can say, well, you can sell off the tail to somebody else or continuity fund and all sorts of stuff. As somebody who is not an IRR-focused investor, but a cash-on-cash return-focused investor who believes that IRR math is a great illusion, especially in worlds of unrealized events, that really the only number that is interesting is at the end of the story, the cash IRR. I think all of those deals that are either continuation funds or tails funds are crappy for LPs. And frankly, for a GP, if you're in a position where you're in carry, cash on cash, increasing your cash on cash return is a better strategy. You make more money. And so I'm very, very comfortable with the idea that signing up for a fund is not signing up for 10 years, but signing up for a much longer arc than that. And there are a couple of people who are still doing venture and being very active, in their 70s. And I think the one person in his 80s who's still very active. I mean, I can be sitting on boards in my 70s, but I'm not going to be an active investor in my 70s if I'm still on this planet. So I had to deal with that. And I think collectively, as the six of us sat around and talked about it over the course of the year, let some time unfold, it became clear that, Foundry as a firm, that should be our last fund. And we should honor the thing we started with, which is one day we would just decide that it was our last fund and then just work as hard as we can collectively as a team, for the long tail of that fund to maximize the value to our investors, which include us, and not be wrapped up in, we need to have more assets and we need to have a continuation strategy and we have to have a this and we have to have a that. But, that what we did was we invested in a bunch of companies. We had some real impact with some of them. We've invested in a lot of funds. I think we have 50 active funds that we're LPs in.
Wow.
I like to think that we've been a really impactful LP for many of them. Lyndall and Jacqueline, who spent a lot of time on building that portfolio with the support from the other four of us, I think built a really great group. And I think it's a great group that we all individually have lots of loyalty and affection for that, will continue to help for a long time. And the returns from that will just play out over time.
So let's talk about Techstars just for a minute. So they're getting a reboot of sorts. David Cohen is back as CEO. You are a co-founder of Techstars, are a co-founder of Techstars. What do you think really worked well for Techstars, and where did things get off track?
Techstars is 19 years old, and I think the simplest way I describe it, and I took this from Cohen, is it definitely had its awkward teenage years. We've all been teenagers, or we have teenagers. We made some mistakes. We snuck out at night. We got drunk. We, did some things that hurt some people's feelings and whatever. That's just part of growing up. When we look back, and I'm having dinner tomorrow night with Walt Winchell, who is a longtime investor in Techstars companies, has been very involved in Techstars from early on. Walt's a great entrepreneur in Boston, and he and I met through an angel investment we both made in a company called Harmonix that created Guitar Hero and then subsequently got bought by Viacom. It created Rock Band. Then the founders bought it back from Viacom. And then Foundry invested in that incarnation. And then it was acquired by Epic,
Wow.
The Unreal people. So amazing journey for Alex and Ron, the co-founders of it. And, it was a really amazing, powerful, and just the journey being amazing is an amazing story because it was one of the few deals that I've been involved in where the earnout actually really paid out. I think the earnout ended up being 4 or 5 times more than the face of the deal value. The deal was a $175 million deal, but then it had a $500 million earnout.
Wow.
And Walt was remarkable because he was the shareholder rep, and it was a 7-year lawsuit with Viacom to settle the earnout.
Oh,
of course, we were using money that we got paid for. We got paid up front for the deal, so maybe spent $20 million to get the $500 million, whatever the numbers were, something in that order of magnitude. But we really got to know each other really well, and he's somebody I just learned a ton from. I would consider him somebody that whenever Walt says something, I'm listening carefully to try to figure out what he said. And this is the answer to the Techstars thing. They're what we did well. 2 of them were things that Walt would say to me over and over again, and both of which I think I heard personally, but didn't listen to in the context of that. And that David has really re-embraced as CEO. One of them is Walt would say over and over and over to me and to David Brown and to anybody who'd listen, some version of bigger isn't better. Better is better. And that's a very fundamental thing that David is focused on right now, which is better is better. And
Techstars got quite big.
It did. And it got big, in lots of dimensions. And it's still big, right? I think the number of companies a year that are, Techstars companies at the peak, I think it was like 700 or 800 companies a year. I think now it's probably 250 a year, and 250 a year is like the right kind of number.
Yeah.
In terms of it. But it's not just the number of companies in absolute. It was like in the programs. When the programs were, 10 companies, they were amazing and magical. And then there were 12, and then there were 15, and then there were 20, and not so amazing and magical. And the difference between, finding 10 amazing companies and putting them, through a program and investing and really getting close to them is different. And I think there is probably for the way we operated and what Techstars did that was so incredible for the first however many years with these companies, I think there's probably a decay curve that was a geometric decay curve as you keep adding companies. So it was that. It was also number of programs. So as the number of programs expand, of course, then you have just a lot more to manage. It's already a complicated thing to manage. But so then the team gets bigger. And so, there came a point during COVID where we decided that we were scaling. And of course, this was also, one of the head fakes from COVID for a lot of companies, which was that everything was going to be digital and the opportunity, to just scale digitally forever was, infinite. And so, we kind of fell into a trap of trying to scale organizationally and build a bunch of infrastructure to scale organizationally much bigger than we were at that point. And some of the things that we did, I think, were really, really useful long term. But looking back on it, a lot of things that were done in a lot of places, things that happened were not effective. When David came back as CEO, he hit reset on all of that. So that's one thing we used to do well. Better is better.
Better is better.
The other thing I'd say that was a real strength of Techstars, which, led to the book I wrote with startup communities. A lot of activities evolved into that, things like Startup Weekend, which, were separate things that ultimately Techstars took over, was this premise that you can build startups anywhere in the world. And this idea that building really vibrant startup communities all over the world was a powerful thing, and a powerful thing for a bunch of network effects that weren't obvious. So this idea of trying to consolidate all the startups in one place, or the line that made me crazy that caused me to then write Startup Communities was, even in 2010, I was hearing people say things like, if you're serious about starting our company, you should just come to the Bay Area because all the great companies are in the Bay Area. And I'm like, no, let me give you a list. Yeah, there's a lot of amazing things about the Bay Area, but let me give you a list of things that are, great companies that are not in the Bay Area. And, oh, by the way, there are plenty of challenges with the Bay Area. And, you get into geo fights, like New York would be like, oh, well, we're New York and, we're going to be better than the Bay Area. Or you'd be in some random place who'd be like, we're going to be the, Silicon Valley of blah. And
the premise that one location has a monopoly on entrepreneurship is crazy to me. I mean, there's a lot of strengths in the Valley, but in the Bay Area,
well, I think it's just fundamentally invalid. And so in 2012, I think a lot of people wanted it to be an invalid hypothesis, but it was still, there was, prove it to me, kind of what's the evidence of it. I think in 2025, it's an invalid hypothesis. But what happened as Techstars continued to scale was concentrate activity in less markets and not actually really understand what made the activity in the individual startup community so powerful. And this was the thing. It wasn't so much concentrating the activity in the markets that was the ultimate problem. The ultimate problem was that we started consolidating capital. So until about 2015, most of the Techstars programs that were geographically centric were funded by local LPs. Techstars funded some, but these were little funds in the geographies they were in. So there's a Techstars New York fund and a Techstars Chicago fund, the Techstars Boston fund. And again, Techstars was part of that, the capital that Techstars, the organization, had. But the local LPs were successful entrepreneurs and some of the VCs in the community that wanted to participate, and people would engage as mentors. And what would happen would be that they really wanted these companies in their local markets to be successful. So they put a disproportionate amount of energy, because they were the pre-seed investors, so disproportionate amount of energy as mentors. And this sort of, they were all in it together. Like, it was a very powerful, feedback loop. That then, when there was success, that capital stayed in the community. So, there's some good stories. Like one of the Chicago funds returned over 100 times the money. And, like all the money just went right back to, Techstars has its piece, and all the rest of it went back from local people who were like, oh, wow, I have this giant box of money that came from this Techstars activity in my community. And so it was very tightly woven. There's a lot of community pride around what was happening.
100%.
And we saw that in different markets: Chicago, Boulder, Seattle. Some of these, there's New York dynamics, even in big cities, right? It was just like people cared a lot about it. When we started aggregating the capital, Techstars, into our centralized funds, like, it was hard to care, or the caring diminished. Yeah, you still wanted the companies to be successful because, it's in your community or whatever, but it wasn't the same dynamic. And so part of David's strategy is not, let's go blanket the world with accelerators. That was part of it. Better is better. It's let's go back to communities that really want to embrace this model, and let's run one special 10-person cohort a year and build some really great companies with those local communities that are long-term self-reinforcing in those communities. And, to David's credit, he had the energy to come back in the CEO role and really commit to that for, that's not like a show up for 6 months and then, find a new CEO. It's like, founder comes back in and said, this is the thing. And as part of that, for me, I told David that I would do anything he wanted to help him. I was on the board, and Foundry has a lot of capital allocated for different parts of Techstars, and it's bad economic trade. But relatively early on, 2010, I gave my founder stock to one of our funds because we were starting to invest in Techstars companies more frequently, and I was starting to feel uncomfortable with some conflict dynamics around it. Yeah, it was, again, it's good for our funds, but and I'm happy I did it. Like, well, in hindsight, with the benefit of hindsight, I'm still happy that we did that. Like, I never felt any discomfort when a Techstars company was successful or failed that Foundry had invested in. But it was interesting. Part of the timing of that re-engagement with David was, and with Techstars, was saying that, I was in hibernation. I've been pretty public about that. And I said to him that I'm going to stay in hibernation. I'm enjoying this, not having a public profile, not engaging this way. What shifted was I had written a first draft of this book, Give First, about 3 years prior. And I'd stuck it on the shelf for a variety of reasons, including I just really didn't feel like getting out in the world and talking about it, which is part of writing a book. At least I think it's part of writing a book. Like, if you care about the ideas, you've got to put some energy into getting the ideas out there. And I took it off the shelf about a month after David came back as CEO. And my reaction to reading it, I had a lot of work to do to turn it from what it was into what I considered to be a good book. But I knew what I had to do. But as I read through it, I'm like, there's some good stuff in here. Like, there's things in here I want to, I don't know how many more books I'm going to feel like writing. This is my 9th book. I want to get some stuff out there that I haven't, blogged about and talked about, but I really haven't codified in long form. And so I did that. And at the end of the year, when I was feeling good about that, I said to David, look, I'm going to spend some chunk of time constrained, out and about, happy to be out and about, not just around the book, but also around Techstars. So, that's been the last 3-4 months. And when Halloween comes, I've said publicly, I turn back into a pumpkin. And I'm not totally sure what that means yet, but we'll see.
Well, tell us about that a bit before we dive into the book. What prompted the decision to disconnect for a bit? Were you withdrawing from something, or were you taking a break, or were you moving towards something? Was there something you were looking for?
Yes, to all of those. So for me, I knew turning 50 wasn't that big a deal to me. 52, 53, some things changed for me. So I had some thoughts around that. I turned 55 coinciding with COVID. So I stopped traveling, obviously for COVID. But then after COVID, I'm like, I'm done. I'm not traveling anymore. And I was aware of this 60 lingering. And there's a couple of hot buttons around 60 for me, that are things that I've tried to work through in therapy, but I'm aware of. One is my dad retired when he was 60. He's still around. He's 87, but that was retirement age. He was a doctor, and he was very deliberate about deciding when he was 60 that he was going to retire. And so there are a couple of other things that made it kind of a meaningful marker for me. So that was the thing. Another was I was coming out of COVID. I was pretty tired of a bunch of things, not fatigued, like physically tired, but emotionally tired of a bunch of things. I didn't really have good words for what it was. I didn't really know why. I didn't know whether I was just getting older. I was becoming the old guy in the room. I was becoming irrelevant, which was fine. Like I had my own language about that, and I'd say, well, I'm becoming irrelevant. But then you're not irrelevant. I'm like, I don't know. Like, maybe I am. Like, I know an awful lot of people that as they get to be in their 60s and 70s, I look at them. I'm like, I think when I was in my 30s and 40s, and I'm like, I don't really want to be that guy. So I was struggling with my own, my own sense of what was important to me. And I was tired of a lot of stuff, right? There was a part of it, for example, which is I was really tired of what I thought had become a shtick in the venture landscape that was very disingenuous. And the shtick was that everybody had become, founder first or founder centric VCs. And, my line to founders was everybody's founder first until they're not. And the day that they're not is the day that you get fired. And so many VCs use that as their sort of patina or part of their marketing and, all the content that they would generate around whatever they were doing. And I'll just speak to one in particular that was the opposite of that, who I think may have come up with the idea or the statement was Josh Koppelman. Like Josh has always been founder first. And he structured his investing strategy and his funds so he could be, because he was the founder. Like he was investing in founders. And that was when, that's what First Round did. And it didn't mean that he shied away from conflict when there was conflict or hard problems or whatever. But, he was able to think of it purely from
alignment,
a founder's point of view. And he had deep alignment with that philosophy. And, somebody said, well, Brad, I can think of 4 situations where Foundry fired founders and you weren't founder first. And my answer is, yeah. Like, we didn't say we're founder first and look at our label. We said, we really care about the relationship we have with founders and we try really hard to have really constructive relationships. And as long as we support the founder, we work for her. But if we don't support the founder for some reason, our job is to try to get back to the place where we support her. And ultimately, as a board member and major investor, we have one tool, which is not obviously just fire the founder, but it's to work with the rest of the board to decide whether it's time to replace CEO.
So your frustration was with the firms announcing that they were founder first, but
it's the bullshit around it, the
not
sort of
being authentic.
posturing and positioning. And I just use this as an example of 20 things.
Yeah.
Where I could give 19 more that were shticks, right? And I say shtick with, I think people know what that is, right? It's like, the way people present themselves, the marketing nonsense versus what they truly are. And, do I have any marketing nonsense in me? Of course, everybody does. Do I have an ego? Of course I do. Do I make mistakes? Of course. Do I disappoint people? Of course. We all do. We're just humans, right? But I was getting tired of that, the dynamic. And then part of what led from that to me that I really saw emerge was I have always believed that the hero of the story is the founder, period. And that a successful company, in the end, the founder might not be involved, but the founder was the hero of the story. And that as the companies grow, even when CEOs become the leader, understanding who the hero of the story is really useful. And if it's a founder CEO, that's easy. When it's a CEO who has taken over leadership, that CEO can be the hero, but how they approach being the hero is important. And I'll give, again, a positive example from this would be Samir Dalokia, who's now at Bessemer. And he came into SendGrid when they were about 40 million in revenue. And SendGrid had a founder, Isaac, and a couple of other co-founders, but Isaac led it for a little while. Then Isaac recruited and a couple of people around the table, including us, recruited a guy named Jim to be the CEO. And Jim did a great job of scaling it up to a certain level, but then hit a wall. And the company was a really good company that was now struggling. It was struggling to continue to grow. It had a bunch of, challenges in terms of market position, whatever. It's history, so it doesn't really matter, but it had some challenges. And eventually Samir was hired as CEO. And Samir is just such a great example of a person who can come into a role like that and not make it about him. And the language that's used in leadership is servant leader, which I think is good language. I've worked with a few people that I would consider servant leaders who are just extraordinary, and Samir being one of them. The interesting thing that happened was he adopted the company's values and tweaked them a little bit to put his own imprint on them. But then really, as he re-accelerated the growth and got SendGrid to a point where it was a public company. Even though he was the hero of the story, he never made himself the hero of the story. The reason for that rant is suddenly everywhere, VCs are making themselves the hero of the story.
Yeah.
And even the VCs who very clearly talk about how important the founder is and how much the founder drives, created their own arc of hero of the story. And that made me, again, tired. So I'm describing random stuff in a box that caused me to feel this way. There may have been some other things, right? And so I just kind of said, you know what? I've been sort of public around a bunch of stuff. I've been very active with a couple of ideas. Obviously the idea that you could build a startup can be anywhere in the world. And the language I would use is democratizing entrepreneurship globally. I mean, that was something I put a lot of emotional and intellectual energy into, as well as physical, traveling around a bunch. I definitely like to think of myself as somebody, who had put a lot of energy publicly into demystifying how venture capital worked, whether it was through, the Venture Deals book that Jason and I wrote, or blogging or talking about it. Demystifying destigmatizing mental health was a big deal for me when I started talking about my own struggles more publicly in 2013, and with Jerry Colonna and a few others like Dave Moran, being proactive around trying to help people not solve a fundamental problem around depression, anxiety, bipolar, mania, whatever, but just destigmatizing it, saying, look, you can be very successful and be open about some of these struggles. And by the way, most of us are just big bags of chemicals, and sometimes our chemicals don't mix. So we all got shit. We all got issues.
It's true.
And so let's just, let's deal with that rather than pretend somehow that there's this, this lack of it. So I did these things, but I just kind of tired of it. And so that, for me, it was just like one day I said to Amy, you know what, I'm just going to stop doing this. And she jumped up and down and cheered and said, maybe your inner introvert can finally get some relief from this. Just last comment on this. I did not, unlike me making a comment of bounding this coming out of hibernation for 6 months and saying I'm going back in at the end of October, I didn't make a pronouncement. I'm going to stop blogging. This will be my last blog for a while because I need to take a break because of bullshit. Look at me. I'm the hero of my own story, right? We're all the hero of our own stories. I just stopped. I didn't need to tell anybody. And that was actually, when I look back on it, a huge relief to just stop. And it gave me time and space to start to try to understand all this stuff that I was feeling that I wasn't kind of processing very effectively.
What do you think? I mean, clearly the book came out of it. The book came off the shelf. What else did you find in your time away?
Well, a bunch of things. I wrote this down, this idea of what I love versus what I like. I like a lot of things, but I really only love a couple of things. Different than people, right? So separate the things from the people. And, spending time with people I love is one of the things I love. And I described it as I love spending time with Amy, but there's more. I love spending time with my brother Daniel. I love spending time with my parents. I love spending time, pick one of my partners. I love spending time with Ryan McIntyre. I love spending time with Jerry Colonna. I love small dinners. So tonight we're having dinner with Morris Wheeler and Joanne Cohen, who's been very active angel investor. You're smiling. Looks like you know Morris.
I know Morris.
Close friend for a long time now. And, Joanne is in Aspen for the Aspen Art Festival. She's huge into art related stuff. She used to be the curator at the Queensland Clinic of their very large art collection. And Amy and I are just going to have a delightful 2 hours with them. At a restaurant, just emotionally intimate. I had an exchange with Howard Lindzen yesterday, who's turning 60, and said, I know you hate big groups, but come to my 60th birthday in Vegas. And I said, no, thank you. But, in November when we're together, how about, Ellen, me and Amy get together, in San Diego? Yep. Put it on the calendar right now. That's love. So I love that. I love reading. I love writing. And writing turns out to be not just blogs and nonfiction. So I wrote code commercially until the early 90s. 1992 is when I stopped.
Yeah.
That's right. I've started writing code again with contemporary tooling. My tools of choice are Cursor, Supabase, and Vercel are my backend of choice. I actually much prefer Claude over OpenAI, although we'll see if the new, 5 release changes that. And it's been absolutely fascinating, to use tooling like that to do stuff when, I know how to write. I know how to write in Python. I never really could do anything meaningful in JavaScript, but now I can, and I can read JavaScript just fine. And if somebody wants to play an early version of a game I did, it's called Dinostroids. It's on the web at dinostroids.com. And of course, it has security holes. So somebody immediately figured out how to make immunity mode last forever and scored, 9 trillion or something like that.
Love it.
But so the writing is interesting. I've been writing some fiction.
Fiction.
And I'm using, after using Scrivener, no, I haven't done it. I haven't come out with anything yet. After using Scrivener for many years as my tool of choice for constructing a book, and then eventually dumping it into Word or Google Docs, I now use something called pseudo-write, which is for fiction is just unbelievable. And so, like, again, finding these very interesting tools that are awesome and experimenting are really fun. And the last is running. I love to run. I love to hike. I love to wander in the mountains alone. So, like, as I wander up to 60, I mean, I don't know whether I have, a day on this planet left or 30 years left, but, the idea of whatever the third of life is being really robust and satisfying. And I mean, I've been doing what I've been doing for 40 years. There's no reason not to continue to do a layer of it. I don't have another career. I'm not going to be a politician. I'm not going to be a teacher. I'm not going to be whatever. But shifting the dynamics, I needed some time and space away to be able to think about how that shift would actually work.
Well, good for you. I mean, you've clearly earned it. And in a space where people are constantly, it just feels like they're one-upping each other. And a lot of these VCs are making it about them. It's nice to hear, somebody that's stepping back from all that, doing the opposite and thinking about what's really important.
Well, thanks. But at the same time, what I care about and what I feel, one of the things that I've wandered into with this is I have a philosophy about life. I have a way of being. I have a set of things that are important to me. I have a value system. I am not really interested anymore. Part of the learning for me is not really interested in judging others on their choice around that. My approach is not the right one. It's just one. There are lots of different ways to be successful. There are lots of different ways to live life. There are lots of different ways to be fill in the blank of whatever you want. And for me, I have always tried to define my own path with, the input and influence of people I respect. I think one of the things that's been confusing to me in 2025 is some of the people that I respect are behaving in ways that are very confusing to me around certain things. Mm-hmm. And so that's hard to process. Like, I don't know what to do with that. But I've decided that it's not going to cause me to say, well, my way's right and your way's not. I don't give a shit about that. That's for you to decide, not me. And so I think if there's anything in that last rant, it's not judgment. I think there's too much of that in our world. I think too many people, it's Amy and I joke about politics for a long time just being some other version of sports ball. Like, do you wear a red shirt or a blue shirt? Well, if you wear a blue shirt, you have to do this. You wear a red shirt, you have to do this. United States. I'm like, you know what? It's fascinating to live in Colorado. I'm unaffiliated. I've been unaffiliated for a long, long time. I proudly wear a blue shirt around my value systems. Most of the time, that's what I embrace, and I support, mostly candidates that wear a blue shirt. But there's plenty of things that, the Democratic Party does that I think is idiotic. And, I personally fear that we're sort of living. That was like the universe trying to say to me, "Don't talk about politics on the podcast." Brad. There was a bee on my head for anybody listening.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he went away pretty quickly. But I kind of think of some of this stuff like an Ouroboros, right? Where like you have this straight line that's now turning into a circle and just eating itself, and nobody can actually be rational about anything because of all the points connecting at the end. But I kind of look at it like, no, I'm not really, I'm interested in engaging with the universe, whatever element of it I engage with, in a way that is consistent with my values. And one of them is learning. One of them is being generous. One of them is being kind, right? And, whether you can navigate those things against what then is the philosophy that I have defined in Give First in, business context, maybe that works and maybe it doesn't. If you reject it, yeah, that Feld guy is totally full of shit. I don't agree with any of that stuff. And, look at where he is. And I'm much happier about where I am. Awesome. It's totally fine. So, and I wish more people felt that way, but yeah, I'm good. I was going to say, I wish more people felt that way. But I think that's a wish in terms of my own internal values rather than something that's, like, and the world would be better if. I don't actually know if it would or wouldn't.
Well, tell us about the book. You put it out. Now was the right time. There was a reason it went on the shelf. Why did you want to get the give first philosophy, out into the public?
Yeah. So let me define it just so it's clear, because I think that's important. And it's important to recognize also that it's a philosophy, not a religion. Religions have rules. Follow the rules and, you go to heaven, or follow the rules and good things happen. My funnest, latest South Park joke, because I have loved South Park forever, is what Buddhism is in South Park, which is you follow the rules and then you die and you get reincarnated and you have to follow the rules again, and then you die and then you get reincarnated again. If you actually follow the rules perfectly, then you don't have to get reincarnated. I kind of think that's like what happens to Kenny over and over again. Kenny is probably just fundamentally Buddhist. I don't know if there might be a South Park episode about that. I haven't seen it. I don't remember it. But as a philosophy, there are no rules to follow. It's just a set of ideas to incorporate if you like them, and to figure out how to incorporate them your own way. So then the give first, the definition is that you're willing to put energy into a system without defining upfront what you're going to get out. Importantly, it is not altruistic. You expect to get something, you just don't know from whom, over what time period, in what form, or in what consideration. And that's a really important construct. The interesting thing about this book, for me, is I tried to combine two concepts. And that was one of the things I had to really work on in the 6 months when I took it off the shelf, because the feedback I got from the 20 or so people that read it was that I jammed these two ideas together: give first, and then something called the Techstars Mentor Manifesto. The Techstars Mentor Manifesto is something that David Cohen came up with some help from John Bradford and I in around 2010, after we've been running Techstars for about 100 companies, about 10 programs. And we'd learned a bunch about what made for effective mentorship versus what wasn't effective.
And you distinguish between advisors and mentors. I think I recall this.
Absolutely. Yeah. Advisors are paid. Mentors are not. Coaches are paid. Therapists are paid. It's not, give first is not pay it forward. It's not obligatory. Somebody once did something for me, therefore I must do something for them. Give first is a choice in terms of how you engage with people. The word mentorship didn't really get used much in entrepreneurship 20 years ago. So it showed up occasionally in big companies as people had a mentor, but mostly it was a mentor who was helping you navigate your way through this big corporate hierarchy. So it's an interesting thing that we were sort of figuring out as we went with this, thing called an accelerator that was new, what mentorship was.
Brad, you won't remember this, I don't think, but when I was raising Fund One, I reached out to you and said, "Will you be an advisor?" And you said, "How about a mentor? It's unpaid."
Awesome. I totally
and
don't
anytime
remember that.
you could cut, and it was great. I was like, 100%.
Well, and what year was that?
This is 2017 or 18.
See, so at least I internalized it. At least I'm internally consistent. So what played from that was the Techstars Mentor Manifesto is 18 bullet points. And again, they're not rules. Don't follow these 18 things to be a good mentor. It was, here's some ideas about how to be effective versus ineffective. And importantly, there are rules that reverse, that they're applicable to the mentor and the mentee. And so the idea of the magical mentor-mentee relationship, which I discovered relatively early in my career, is when the mentor and the mentee become peers. And the mentor is learning as much from the mentee as the mentee learns from the mentor. And this has been really powerful for me, because many of the people I think who consider me a mentor, whether it's in Techstars or other contexts, whether it's labeled that or not, it's irrelevant. In these relationships, the ones that are most fulfilling is where I'm learning from them as well as them learning from me. I've heard David, I'll just use him as an example because we're so obviously peers at this stage of life. But there are lots of points along the way where David would just kind of say some version of, gosh, I'm getting so much from my relationship with you, Brad. And I just play it back to him. I say, David, I'm doing this. I love this because of what I'm learning from being around you and doing it with you and seeing what you do. And many of these ideas wouldn't have emerged as ideas that I could do something with until, I saw him executing on them in certain ways that caused me to think about it in a different way. So these concepts are all interwoven, right? The philosophy in this book, the philosophy of give first, not a rule, but a philosophy. That's part one. Part two is 18 relatively short chapters on each item of the Techstars Mentor Manifesto with a long form description of what we mean by it. An example, many of the examples are memoirish or from my own experience. Some are not, but there's a lot of from my own experience, because one of the important things in the Mentor Manifesto is, and something I learned a long, long time ago, is that the best way for people to understand a point is not to say you should do this, but to give them a story from your own experience and to help them navigate through the thought process. Another key one is that as a mentor, you're just providing data. The mentee should be totally comfortable ignoring your data. You want them to hear your data. You want them to consider your data as a mentor. That's all. And as a mentor, if you expect the mentee to do what you tell them to do, you're not going to be very effective. You have to view it just as data. There's another one in there called guide, don't control. The idea that you're guiding with your stories and your data. You're not trying to control. You're not trying to get to a particular outcome. And oh, by the way, as a mentor, a lot of times you're wrong. Your data might be an N of one, or you might have extrapolated from the wrong thing, or you might not be understanding the context. So part of the power of that relationship and that approach is that when the mentee does something different and is successful, you're like, oh, wow, that's interesting. I just learned something, right? So each of the 18 chapters sort of go about that. And then I end after the example, I kind of have a thing that ties it all back together. Part three is problems with Give First. Every philosophy has problems.
Yep.
And, the idea that there aren't real problems with Give First is nonsense. And so I have a section about that, and I try to talk through some of these problems in substantive ways and what I've done to try to deal with them, sometimes effectively, sometimes not. And then the last part I just want to mention quickly is a part called entrepreneurial tzedakah. And tzedakah is a Hebrew word that means loosely righteousness. Gets translated often as charity. It comes from Maimonides, sort of created this construct called tzedakah. And he gave the eight levels of tzedakah. And for me, the first level of tzedakah is not some song that Neil Sedaka wrote, although his parents probably changed the spelling of his name from TZ to SE when they came to the US, or whatever generation it came to the US. But what it does is it says is to give someone something before they know they need it to enable them to then go accomplish something. And for me, my reaction to that when I first read that, somebody had pointed me at the eight levels of tzedakah, and I knew about them a little bit from being Jewish, but I never really read them carefully. That first one sounds like angel investing to me. And that was kind of like my emotional reaction. I've called angel investing for-profit philanthropy for a long time. And the interesting thing that came out of it for me was this idea of tying together this construct with, 10th century philosophy. Like there was something I liked about that. I won't pretend to be anywhere close to as good as Ryan Holiday at this stuff. But, the idea that some of these ideas are timeless, or the notion that some of these ideas are timeless, made me feel like it was a good way to wrap up a book about a philosophy that if somebody said, well, what do you hope to get out of this book? And my answer is, I just hope it impacts some people see in themselves, some elements of this, or some people see some things in this that they say, wow, that's cool. I want to include that in how I do stuff. And, I'd like to believe that nothing here is new, not new ideas, just packaged in a way for people in the entrepreneurial landscape, anybody who's a founder or an investor or interested in participating in companies, or a mentor, or even people working in startup communities who would look at and say, hey, this is additive. This is a good way to think about some of the things I'm doing.
So there's a lot of directions we could go in here. Something that comes to mind.
You got 15 minutes more of my life before my little buzzer goes off and tells me to do the next thing.
Okay. All right. We'll try and make it quick. So you talked about mentoring and how you're a data point, right? And the mentee has to take in all these data points. Many years ago, a startup of mine was going through a crisis, big crisis, bigger than most. And I emailed you, and you got on the phone with me that day. And the crisis was with another board member. And the founder was listening to this other board member, not because he had the data, but because he had the loudest voice and a very convincing way about him.
Never before in the history of startups.
Right. So you gave me great counsel at the time. We ended up seeing our way through it. But how do you think about that, Brad? Like when you're a reasonable voice, but there's somebody much louder, much more passionate with an opinion that you feel is fundamentally wrong and is going to steer your mentee, in the wrong direction.
I joked first time it's ever happened. I mean, that's continual. Happens all the time.
All the time.
And it's one of the challenges, I think, especially of investor heavy boards, where the power dynamics get confused between who is actually the one who's driving the real power dynamic here. And, you'll often see situations where, you have a board that's supposed to be functioning as a group, as a team. And all of a sudden, the investor who has the largest shareholdings is behaving in a way that is in their frame of reference, but not actually listening to anybody else. Or you have an investor who might not be the largest shareholder, but just happens to be, a personality type that is, extremely assertive and extremely loud. And by the way, extremely assertive and extremely loud, if that person is I'll get the cliche right, strong opinions, loosely held person, that strong, forceful opinion can be extremely disorienting and confusing because that person will, not hold on to their opinion. If it's somebody who is a softer voice, but when they express something, they really feel strongly, and it's really their carefully considering
viewpoint.
Right. Viewpoint. That was the word I was searching for. So you forget words. You have to know the archetype of the person you're dealing with because that's part of it too. For me, I like to think that I'm assertive, but that I am very comfortable that most of the things I'm saying are data or a hypothesis. And so I think most people are comfortable challenging me or questioning or disagreeing. Maybe not all, but hopefully. I don't think I react I don't think I react negatively in that context. So again, like when I'm in that situation, when I'm on the opposite side, where I feel like somebody is being really assertive about something that is either incorrect or is not really, reading the room, listening to the conversation, understanding what the real issue is, which is actually maybe even a bigger part of the problem, which is somebody, issue A, and somebody responds really forcefully with advice for solving issue B.
Yeah,
so
right.
It's like, it's issue A. Come on. Like when we talk about issue A, well, and then forcefully again, you're not hearing me. It's really issue B, right?
It's a sales problem, not a product problem, right?
That's right. It's like, no, time out. Like I'm the CEO here. I don't have a sales problem right now. I got a product problem. Will you just listen to me? Nope. If you just hired a new enterprise salesperson and fired your sales team and fixed marketing, it would all be great. Or the inverse, like, it doesn't matter about sales at all. You just have to get the product right. If people are pulling it out of your hands, no matter what, it'll work.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Which, especially when you're getting this with very little nuance, or, as the founder, the CEO, you laboriously put together a board package that you're pretty comfortable the person that's making this assertion didn't read or opened, you gave it to them 3 days in advance and they opened just before the meeting and spacebar through the pages. What I try to do in those situations is not fight with the person. I try to extend the conversation. I try to engage around the issue where I'm not trying to be a mediator between points of view, but I'm trying to stretch the ideas. I'm trying to get out of the A versus B and try to connect all the pieces together and get the conversation to be broader.
Different altitude.
Yeah, different altitude is actually I've not used that before. I'll use it. Get conversation to happen at different altitude. And a lot of times the altitude is closer to the problem, right? It's getting to the root cause of the problem. And in the book, I talk about the 5 whys as a technique. And, I'm sure everybody sat in the room with the person who's, Mr. Socrates that just asked some questions and you just don't know where it's going. I try not to be Mr. Socrates with no point of direction when I'm asking questions. I try to have a place I'm trying to go, guide.
Yes.
And it's not always right. I'm not always successful in those conversations, but it tends to change the tempo of the conversation when, the bombastic person slows down and takes a pause. And when they slow down and think, a lot of times, actually, they'll see that they're talking about B, not A. Or they'll listen to somebody else in the room talking and they'll be like, I hadn't really thought about it that way. And they might still become assertive about what it needs to be, but it's got more tone to it. What I've found to be not constructive is when all of a sudden people get into the equivalent of a battle that escalates. Or, and the other side of and I've had plenty of those. And when I see that happening, it's like, hey guys, we're on the same team, take it down, pause, like we're on the same team. Okay, we're all paused. Let's talk about what the issues are, not get angry at each other to whatever.
Emotions just take over at that point.
Take it out, like the same team. And, that's a line I will, I don't have to use it that often, but every now and then it's something that I'll blurt out when I feel like people are really being not constructive with each other. The piece that I regret, I think of my own behavior that I regret in these situations that's ineffective, is passive avoidance. And I look back, on 40 years, when I look at my biggest things that I regret, it's not the things I've failed at. I've failed at a lot of stuff. I've had plenty of success. But when I think about failure, I don't regret that. That's just part of the entrepreneurial experience. That's actually part of trying to create anything. It's, endless series of experiments, most of which don't work. And the key is to learn and create a new hypothesis and run a new experiment. The passive avoidance is, the issue is there.
And you didn't deal with it.
You just don't deal with it. That's different than active avoidance. The issue is there and you say, you know what? There's an issue right there. And
let's work the problem.
I'm not going to do anything about it.
Right.
That's active avoidance.
Yes.
It's yours to deal with. I'm not doing anything about that problem is a very acceptable way to be in this world. Passive avoidance, I see the problem. I'm just going to put my head in the sand. I see the problem. I'm going to go complain to somebody else about the problem. I see the problem. I'm going to try to address it, but not head on. I'm going to address it by dealing with something else. That's what I regret. I regret when I was passive avoidant in situations. And yeah, sure, some of the situations I was passive avoidant didn't work out fine. So it's the ones that didn't work out fine are the ones I regret. I look at them like, man, if I had actually engaged with how I felt at the time with the person around the issue or the company or the people, it still might have failed. I still might have a broken relationship. It still might be whatever, but at least I would have tried.
Well, and the founders remember, like the people that really engage during the hard stuff.
Oh yeah.
They remember and they come back to you for, the next one.
Well, not just founders. I think it's everybody across the landscape. I mean, whether it's founders, business partners, co-investors, other people, I think, power impacts how people relate to each other a lot. And so, okay, that's a thing, put that in a box. I think reputation, external reputation matters. And, reputation is, what's the Warren Buffett line, built in the decades, destroyed in a minute.
Yeah.
Right. And reputation is not universal. One's reputation means different things to different people based on whatever the experiences are and how they view you and what you represent. And then you've got this third thing, which is the shared experience. And I think the best fidelity in relationships is the shared experience. And the problem is passive avoidance is a unilateral version of the shared experience. I'm having a shared experience, but now I'm going to take my part of the shared experience and that's a problem. And I'm going to go wander somewhere else and either not deal with it by burying it in the ground or deal with it by talking with other people about it. And okay, if I talk to other people to try to figure out what to do and then come back to you and then deal with it, okay, that's not passive avoidance. But if I just talk to other people about it, but never come back and deal with it with you, that's not constructive. That's not a shared experience, even the good and the bad.
Well, you've shared a lot of the goods, but you've shared a lot of the tough stuff too, publicly. And it allows people to have that shared experience. And so, I applaud you for that and appreciate it.
Thank you. Look, I think that comes from my own belief that this is a finite experience. The lights go out one day and it's over. And I think my parents were really influential on me on this concept in terms of the idea of living life to its fullest while you're here And again, my value system doesn't have to be imposed on anybody else. Everybody should choose their own value system and choose their own beliefs and choose their own whatevers. But part of that for me is like woven into this idea of, hey, I'm killing it. It's all great. Is just, it's just such a line of bullshit. Like, no, come on. Like everybody's got, I wrote this blog post a while ago, but I love how many people roll it out every now. It's like, it's the thing that is on repeat, in the thing that random people send me every now and then. The blog post, something new is fucked up in my world every day. And the key word there being new. I by the way, I know what today's is. Like I got a text about it about 30 minutes ago. So when I finished with this, it's, I can.
I was just hoping it wasn't a bee sting on the head.
No. But I can address it, but I know what it is. I'm like, oh, great.
Sorry to hear that. Well, we have way overstayed our welcome here. Maybe one final question before we let you go, Brad, and something on Give First. So what advice or feedback would you have for folks that want to live this philosophy, but find that the amount of requests coming in can be overwhelming? They're dealing with burnout. The world has gotten more complex, right? There's more demands on your time. You're somebody that can relate with this more than most. So how do you advise people deal with that when they're trying to live Give First?
Fortunately, part 3 talks about this, and then there's some other stuff woven through it in other parts of the book. One of the things that I've tried to do is a combination of modulating my own time around this while being very accessible, and then coming up with a set of techniques that don't put the burden of, I would say, first and second and third contact on me. So sort of modulating my time, I'll start with that. Like, this is not spend 100% of your time being this way. It's spend 10% of your time being this way. Like, my current joke, I need to come up with another one because I've used it on too many podcasts now. So people are sick of hearing it, but it's fortunately we're at the very end of your podcast. So probably all the people listen to my podcast, anything I'm on have stopped listening by now or on 5x speed. The line is somebody will say to me, "Oh, you're the Give First VC. How about you give me $5 million and I'll give you something back in the future?" Like, there's a lot of everything that's transactional. That's part of life.
Yeah.
That's part of business, but like, it doesn't have to be part of everything. And can you have elements of what you're doing that are not transactional? Or can you approach new relationships? And the words I like to use are non-transactional, positive sum, multi-turn, right? So like incorporating that construct into it. So for starters, it's not 100%. If somebody says, well, you're not acting in a Give First way in this situation, I'm like, so, I'm not obnoxious about it. I'll have a conversation about, well, what do you mean? Why is that important? Let's deconstruct that a little bit. And that usually gets to like this conversation. The other is, I get too much inbound. By the way, when I was in hibernation, the decay curve's real. So it's nice. Like all of a sudden, if you're not out and about and podcasts and writing blog posts every day and stuff like that,
it tails off.
You get less. So that was nice. For me, part of living in Boulder for a long time and being very visible nationally is whenever somebody was coming to Colorado, not necessarily to Boulder, but to Colorado, that was a founder or an investor. Somehow I was like, I get an email. Email's fine, easy to find, about getting together. And there was a point in time where, I was getting so many invitations for coffee or a meal that if all I did was say yes, and I'm kind of default.
That's all you would do
as a nature. Well, I drink coffee, I eat food, I go to the bathroom. That would be my day, which of course is impossible. So one of the technique I learned was when somebody reaches out to me that I don't know, I give them a very brief assignment that's relevant to them reaching out to me and relevant to what they're asking about, that won't take more than 15 minutes to respond to. So, there'll be things like if somebody says, I'd love to get together with you for coffee. I'm going to be in, Boulder next week for blah, 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 and has their company name, and I'll look up at their company and I'll see their company so I can see on the web what the thing is. I might send an email back and I looked on the web. I see your company's this. Can you be specific about what you want to do and getting together around? So just be specific. 50% of the people never respond.
Just drop off.
I view that as a blessing Because those 50% of the people are trying to get together with me for some reason. I mean, who knows? But it's probably not something to do with something that's going to be productive for both of us. 25% of the people answer the question really well, and I have more context. And, we can usually a lot of times go back and forth on email without me having to get together. So I can actually start to engage in a relationship without having to get together for coffee, because it was something that I could address that way. They were just starting with, can you get together with coffee? Because that's what we've been trained to do when we want to engage with somebody. And then 25% of the people I wouldn't hear from for a couple of days. And then I'd get something back from them that was, I thought about what your question was, and I actually went and did all this research, and I found these things, and I actually did this, and I'm doing that. And, really appreciate the time and energy. And would it be okay if we, I email you in the future? And my answer is, I want to actually know this person, right? Because this person's a doer. And so it allowed me to sort of, without filtering, without having a gatekeeper, without having to decide, is this person important or not? Or do I want to spend time? Because number one, for me, it's important to be open. I like to say, but open to randomness. So many really amazing things have happened in my world by just kind of saying yes to stuff, or by engaging with people I didn't know. A value system of mine is being accessible. Another value is being responsive. And you gave a couple of examples of it with you, right? I'm not an LP in your funds. I don't if you said, hey, Brad, what have we done together? Commercially, my answer is, I don't know. But I like you. We spent time together. We've developed a friendship. I like the stuff you invest in. I want to be additive and helpful. It's easy when you ask, for a response to something that's urgent for me to do a quick call. In the context of that, in that 10% of my time that I'm behaving that way, or 20% of my time, maybe I behave that way more than 10%. So it's understanding those things. But I would say, even with that, for me, I'll end on a construct in this that's been really hard for me, but I've gotten good at it. It used to be very hard for me. I had to learn how to do it. And now I think I'm very good at it, which is moving between default yes and default no. A long time ago, I taught my wife, Amy, how to blow things off and how to decommit to things you don't want to do. I've always been pretty good at, when I realize I am truly overloaded, saying, you know what, I'm overloaded. I can't do this. I have to decommit. And I go through phases where that happens. The reason that I get overloaded is when I flip into default yes mode, I just can't say no. I just say yes to everything. And in our jobs as investors, by the way, we say no anyway to a lot of stuff. I mean, if I say no 50 times in a row, I got to say yes. I just, I need to reset my no counter because it's too many. And I need the satisfaction of saying yes. And so, that becomes a thing, that I need as well. I've gotten better at that. And I can sort of flip between default yes and default no, where even with default no, the answer is not no to everything. It's that the posture is no. And then I choose very deliberately whether I want to say yes. And when I'm in that kind of a phase, it's a much less reactive phase. And the 2 years that I was in hibernation was very much a default no phase. And I did learn how to be more deliberate about where I was spending my time, because less things came in, and I was able to say no to all the public facing stuff, just no. And so then the stuff I was looking at, I'm like, I'll engage, I'll be responsive, but do I actually want to spend time on this? I had time and space to consider that, which I really hadn't. I didn't have the muscle for it before. Now I think I do.
Well, Brad, I'm so grateful that we caught you at a moment when you weren't hibernating, and that you've been so gracious with your time and with your advice and feedback over the years with me, and of course with the audience here. So he's the man that wrote Give First, and he's the man that lives it as well. He's Brad Feld, and thank you so much, Brad, for joining us today.
My pleasure, Nick.
Thank you, sir.